big smart comics over here.
So are you going to, do you
I'll
want
do
to?
your intro.
So Emmett's going to intro.
All right.
Ready?
Yeah, go ahead, Emmett. We can hear you.
Okay. My name's Emmett. I'm helping out, filling in for Mr. Seamus, who's usually here doing this, but can't be with us tonight. Father Jeff Langan was ordained a priest of Opus Dei in 2015. Before that, he was a professor of politics and philosophy at Holy Cross College in Notre Dame. He published articles and books on the French Revolution, geopolitics, and a guidebook for university life. He has been a close collaborator with Dr. E. Michael Jones since 2003. For tonight's format, Father Jeff has prepared a brief introduction to the ordered topics for the summer. Our hope is that the majority of the time could be an AMA, which is
Ask me anything.
Ask me anything. Ask me anything. You can post a question on Locals or on a Google Doc. We sent the link via email, or simply raise your hand if you have a question here, and I, Emmett, will moderate the questions. All right.
Good. So I'll just give a brief intro, and then we can open up the floor. So I thought, so we've met about maybe 6 times in the last year and a half. And during the school year or during the academic year, just given my priestly, like, for example, the last 3 months I was out. I was out every weekend. So there was really no opportunity to meet. And just talking over things with Seamus thought, well, number one, it would be great to have just an open forum, question and answer. And then on the other hand, we thought that it might be good just to have not that we have to be wedded to the topics, but it could be good to, Seamus was asking me, what's the course you enjoyed teaching the most when you were a professor? And just to give us like a series of topics to go into. And obviously we can make up in the sense of we can cook up a topic whenever we want based on what's happening in the world and how to explain it more deeply, given the time and the knowledge that we have. So Seamus and I thought that, well, we would just put together a series of topics. I'm going to be here all summer. I don't have any travel plans except for one weekend. So we thought that, well, that would be maybe this summer we could try to get 6 topics in, 2 each month, and be a little bit more orderly about it. And then just in speaking with Seamus about my favorite class. So when I was a professor, they asked me one semester to teach a class where they said, you can assume that these are seniors at the university. They've taken 4 classes in American history. They've also taken probably 2 classes in American literature. And we want you to teach a class called The American Experience in the 20th Century. And we don't want it to be a history class in the strict sense of you got to know this date, you got to know this date, you got to know this other date. They said, we want you to go through and try to come up with like a thesis, almost like you're introducing them to more advanced research. Come up with a thesis for the course and then argue the thesis in the course, especially thinking about, well, how do you interpret events? Right? And so what I did for this course was I did what a professor taught me to do back in my early graduate studies in politics. He said, it's very interesting, right, to take 6 weeks of a newspaper and maybe to have a question in mind, or just read for 6 weeks, and even to read from a selection of newspapers. And that can give you a sense of a question to ask or something along those lines. So in 2003, this Harvard professor, I think he actually also worked for the CIA, but he was a Harvard professor. He wrote a book called Who Are We? It was a book on American identity. And he was specifically interested in the Hispanic, what he considered to be the Hispanic threat to American identity. And so I thought, well, that's what I'll do. If I'm teaching the American experience in the 20th century, I'll read 6 weeks of newspapers from 1900, and then I'll read 6 weeks of newspapers. Well, this would have been 2008. I'll read 6 weeks of newspapers from 2008, and I'll ask the question of this book: who are we? What's our identity? What do we? This book was all about what he thought this author was articulating, what he thought was American identity, and also what he thought would be a threat to American identity. So I thought when I read these newspapers from 1900, I'll ask myself the same question. In 1900, what did they think was American identity? And what did they think were the threats to American identity? And then I'll do the same thing in 2008. What did they think was American identity? What are the threats to American identity? And so in the basic, and this became the basis of the course that I taught, that in 1900, whenever they were writing these little articles about like what is American identity, right, they would always characterize America as a Protestant nation. America is a Protestant nation. America in its founding was a Protestant nation. And so what were the threats to American identity? The threats to American identity were Irish, German, Italian immigrants, Polish immigrants. Right? Why? Because that was representing a threat to this Protestant national identity. And then I read a selection of newspapers from around the country. That was kind of how I suppose nowadays you could do this very quickly with AI, because AI just takes pictures of all the evidence that's out there, right? So then I read 6 Weeks More Contemporary, and it was interesting, right? The America was characterized, its identity was characterized as a Judeo-Christian nation. And so then the threats to it were perceived threats against those values, however you go in and define Judeo-Christian values. And so I thought, well, that's going to be the topic of the course. Why did we change from Protestant nation to Judeo-Christian? And then how did that happen, and what does it signify, and is it true, right? Are these names pointing to a reality, or are these names made up for other purposes, right? That became the theme of the course. So in the first part of the course, we read a selection of authors. I just exposed my students to, who were people that thought they articulated America as a Protestant nation, right? The best representatives of it. So Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Henry Ford, right? Those were the guys. And we read writings of all of those characters. Right? Henry Ford published his own magazine, the Dearborn Independent. Theodore Roosevelt gave speeches about, actually Theodore Roosevelt, in one of his famous speeches, he said, we Protestants aren't having children anymore. And if we're not manly enough to have children, the Catholics deserve the country. Theodore Roosevelt was kind of, he was a unique character in many ways. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, even though he was what we would call now very secular, he was like a fallen away Protestant, but he was still, as most Protestants in those times, the one thing they kept as they lost their faith was their anti-Catholicism, right?
Sure.
Which is very much the case with Theodore Wilson. But Theodore Wilson was also this quirky character. Right? What was the first film shown in the White House?
You see Roosevelt and Wilson.
Wilson.
It was
Woodrow Wilson.
Klan.
The Birth of a Nation was the first film shown in the White House, right? Woodrow Wilson was this quirky guy, and for whatever it's worth. So then, well, as I did my own research, further reading and whatnot, I just thought, well, it's clear, right? It's clear. The Protestant elite especially, right? They realized by 1940, 1930, 1940, they realized we're going out of business, right? We're not having children. We have to let the immigrants into the elites. And so they began letting Jewish and Catholic immigrants into the elite institutions in the 30s and 40s. And I think that's part of the origin of this term Judeo-Christian, right? That after the Second World War, there was an effort to try to harmonize various elites on the East Coast, especially for political reasons. And so they concocted this term Judeo-Christian as a way of trying to harmonize Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish elites around certain values for the sake of uniting the nation and fighting the Cold War against the communists. So a lot of this course became, well, these three groups, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, especially elites, and how they interacted with each other, especially from 1950 to the present. And that's the course that I thoroughly enjoyed teaching. I think the students thoroughly enjoyed it, based on a response that I got from many of the students after the course. And so what I thought we could do with this summer seminar is, the course was 40 lectures. We don't have 40 lectures for this summer, but I thought what we could do is we could take a series of the topics that I covered in that course, and we could just do the same in the course of the seminar. And with a view towards, again, the purpose of that course was, okay, we want to understand, right, the times that we're in right now, right? We want to understand. So I would say we want to try to understand better what's happening in 2026, and of course, this I was teaching at a Catholic university, so part of the idea was, especially what are the resources that the Catholic Church had. When you look at history, you can also ask yourself the question: the Catholics who were among those elites, what were the resources available to them as far as within the patrimony of the faith? Did they take advantage of those resources? And also, what were the strengths and weaknesses also of their own human understanding of what was happening to them? There's one example that where at the University of Chicago, we'll go into this at some point, but at the University of Chicago in the 1930s, there was this one Catholic professor from France, and he thought he was there doing everything he possibly could, right, to reach out and befriend certain other professors on the staff. And we know from looking at the diaries of these professors now that these professors hated Catholics. They were, and also these professors were secret Stalinists, and they wanted nothing to do, right, with this one professor who was trying to reach out to them. So it's through no fault of his own, unless maybe he was bad at reading body language. Maybe there were certain signs that were being sent to him that he ignored. Maybe he was being naive. Who knows? But that would just be an example of, well, there was an effort of this one professor to reach out to others, and there was no being met halfway. But probably not because there was any deficiency in his faith, but somehow he didn't understand what was happening. Now, in this case, in the University of Chicago in the 1930s, the one professor that was opposing this fellow he was a secret Stalinist. Nobody knew he was a Stalinist. You had to read his diaries to understand this. So one question always when you study history is what patrimony was available to those who were actors in those events? To what degree did they take advantage of their Catholic patrimony or not? And then also even their human understanding. They could have human deficiencies. They could be human mistakes. Oftentimes when we study history, at least when I study history, it's always interesting to make this distinction between what are the categories in the guy's mind. Are those categories, do they correspond to the truth? And do they correspond to the realities that we're trying to explain, right? That's, I think, a fundamental distinction. But why? Because we want to face our own times, right? We want to try to assess our own times using correct categories, using the truth, which will set us free, and also using the human knowledge that's available to us, human learning that's available to us. I also think that especially for parents and families, right, that one purpose of something like this is that a lot of where children learn to negotiate the world is really through the dinner table. It's through conversations and it's not that we have to know everything, right? But I think that we learn how to start to ask questions, how to be open, how to understand what's true, what's false. How do you verify or not? How do you assess, right, what's coming through, right? That's one of the things that I think we hand on to it's one thing a professor hands on to his students in the classroom, but I think parents They really help their children to do this as well. We help our friends do it also when we're with them. So I think that's part of the value of this. I I sent this one little chapter on Gran Torino because the film Gran Torino, I think it brings together many of the threads that I would like to discuss this summer, right? And you can understand many of the threads of what I'd like to, because one thing I want to discuss is I think this guy Walt Kowalski, he represents the the Polish Catholic guy that worked in factories in Detroit, and he was subject to, ultimately he was subject to a number of social and cultural realities that he probably wasn't fully aware of. The Catholic Church comes up in this film as well. He eventually goes to confession because he promised his wife he would go to confession, and so there's it's interesting there from that standpoint as well. This film, and the immigration issue is, it's always an issue in American history. Uh, One of the things that Samuel Huntington points out in his book is that there's a real difference between being a settler and being an immigrant. Right? There is something about being the first people in a place, because why? You set the customs, you set the law, you set expectations. Whereas an immigrant, the big question of the immigrant is, how do I integrate? How do I assimilate? It's a little bit of a different set of questions. So I thought, and Gran Torino was in many ways a unique film. There's very few films like it, and I know from Clint Eastwood's biography that it's also a film. It's another thing that made it unique is that the guy that wrote the screenplay, Clint Eastwood, basically took it and said, "We're just doing the screenplay." He didn't really change hardly anything of the screenplay for the sake of making the film. Because why? The film is a thought piece, really, about, and it might be one of these films where, as Plato usually says about the artist also doesn't fully understand and can't fully explain everything that he's doing. So I thought the Gran Torino is there's so many things that I would like to discuss this summer in more detail. That by the way, also my own personal life, my grandmother was a Polish Catholic from the neighborhood that's also portrayed in that film. And I have my own personal stories with my grandmother that it's also part of how I met Dr. Jones, and how actually even probably some of the own research I did in my own life were because of my own relationship with my grandmother. So that's why I just put that little chapter on Gran Torino, because I do think it's a film that based on what I would like to discuss this summer. And by the way, also, I'm not attached to these topics, right? So if something else comes up, that's fine too. If anybody has any suggestions at any given moment. So that's my brief introduction. And then I know there is one question on the Google document already.
Yeah.
And again, there's no reason. I just wanted, I find giving people as many different possibilities for writing down questions or for asking questions, that can be helpful. It's also fine that there just be live questions too. But I thought, well, the first thing I'd do is I would, if we get really sophisticated, I know someone that if there's lots of questions, what a friend of mine does who online is he'll say the tip questions go first. Yeah. But we don't have that. We don't have hundreds of people yet. So anyway, so here's a little bit of a longer question. A recent Tucker Carlson interviewee considered a contemporary philosopher and activist named James Wright spoke about cultural propaganda and political techniques that are becoming increasingly visible, such as gender, race, religion, a shaking of the ant jar, so to speak. His concentration on the word technique in this liberal democracy system seemed to lack an explanation of every tool used and who is using it. Can you elaborate on this? TV, film, media, porn, organized gambling, sports, high interest lending, usury, the Frankfurt School, etc. So I want to break. Is it specific to a certain religious or radical homogeneous group, or is it strictly secular hedonists of the Western system that include all walks of life in the academic intelligentsia and the intelligence community? Finally, we know they are just working for the oligarchs in the U.S. and the entire West. What makes up the majority of the oligarchs in the West? So there's several questions here. And I think there's several topics that, are worth considering throughout. One is just the techniques of propaganda. By the way, this is in the Pope's most recent encyclical, right? Actually, everything in this question is in the Pope's encyclical. One of the underlying themes in the Pope's encyclical is a real concern that St. Josemaria also puts this in one of his homilies, where he says, you look around the world and you see that the means, that wealth and the means of culture and politics are controlled by the few, right? They're put in the hands of the few. And the many don't have access to them. And this is a problem that goes back to the ancient world. In our first seminar, in the first time we met, we read this article on Plato and the Sophists. Right? The Sophists were the first ones to start to really try to develop techniques that could be used to manipulate perception, because they felt that there's no truth, there's only the possibility of manipulating perception. In the 20th century, the first man that I think writes a big book on this that's of interest is Walter Lippmann, his book Public Opinion. And he was part of a committee that Woodrow Wilson put together in order to, because Woodrow Wilson ran against entering World War I. Right? We're not going to go to war. That was Woodrow Wilson, how he got elected. And so Wilson knew that the American people in general were against the war, against entering the war. And so he had to come up with a system of influencing public opinion to try to get enough people on the side of going to war to make it palatable. So he hired Walter Lippmann and a bunch of others to do it, basically to form a committee to come up with, well, what are the ways that we can influence people? So one of the ways that he describes in his book was, well, let's have a 7th inning stretch at baseball games, and let's turn it into a pageant. So not just a stretch. And so in Detroit, for example, what they would do is they put out it was very primitive, but they would put like a box on the field, right? And then they would have these Polish peasants walk into the box on one side wearing Polish mountain garb, right? Whatever the Polish mountain people wore. And then they'd come out of the other side of the box wearing bowling shirts and maybe USA bowling shirts or USA flag on the bowling shirts, and looking like good old American factory workers. Obviously, that's very primitive, but that's one of the features of propaganda, right? Whenever you notice propaganda from a different age, it seems very primitive, and you say to yourself, well, how could they have fallen for that? And another thing that's about propaganda is that people are usually pretty good at identifying propaganda when it's coming from when it's directed at, like, not at them, right? So for example, if you're pro-life, you're very good at identifying pro-choice propaganda. Why? Because you're not pro-choice, and so you're very good at. But one of the famous theorists of propaganda, a guy named Jacques Ellul, he says that the difficulty with propaganda is really the intellectual classes, right? The lawyers, the doctors, the professors. They are the ones that are the worst at identifying the propaganda that's directed at them. Right? They're not very good at understanding how they are being propagandized, even if they're good at showing how everyone else is subject to it. And in fact, Jocko Ellul, he goes a little bit further. He says, and his book it's just a scientific, it's a sociology book. It's just a very, he says in this book, I just want to explain what is propaganda and how it's used. I'm not trying to make value judgments about it. I'm just saying this is what happens. It's the classic work on propaganda. But he says one of the things he points out in this book is that most governments, when they're thinking over time, he wrote this book, I think, in the 60s or 70s. But he says most governments, when they're thinking of propaganda, they're thinking of the object of their propaganda are the intellectual classes, not the working guys. Why? Because it's the intellectual classes that are connected with the oligarchs, the elite, right? And those are the ones you really have to lay it on thick. Right? Those are the ones you really want to sway their opinion. So the political techniques, and I would say that again, I would just on this question here that I think I think when I left this country for Rome in 2012, I think very few people would even, people who discussed propaganda were like a really small minority of intellectuals and crazy people, right? So I think just the idea that there is propaganda, that it can be used against a population, it's a much more common concept now. It's much more, readily acceptable by ordinary people, right? So I think that's actually an improvement, right? That there are people who are aware. And though what also really strikes me is how time and again, every time you turn around the corner, like once again, you realize, oh, that's propaganda, right? So even AI, right? I think then the Pope points this out in his encyclical, but though this is, many other people observe this. AI is very much, what AI tells you is not some sort of truth, right? Especially when you're dealing with things in the humanities or social life or whatnot. AI is very much a reflection of the person that programs it, right? And the Pope is saying over and over again in the encyclical, right? A lot of times the people who are shaping the opinion of AI are people who have very particular narrow interests of the few or of some place. So now the next thing is another big theme of this course that I taught was, again, and this goes back to the ancient world, the sophists thought that the perfect form of government for them would be something that you could use propaganda to convince people that they were in a democracy, but that really what it was an oligarchy, right? The interest of the few and the wealthy, right? So the government of the few and the wealthy in their interest, right? So a government in the interest of the wealthy and the powerful, the few, right? So the going back to the ancient world, the sophists felt that you want to have a form of government where the vast majority of people will say we're in a democracy, but that's really a form of, for the sophists, that's just a perception. It's not the reality. The reality is that the few, right? And historically in oligarchies, it's just a fact that the elite factions that make up it. An oligarchy is never uniform. Right? You may have a few that make it up, but there's always several factions that make up even the few. Right? They always break up into factions because they have different interests and they have different sources of income, different sources of money, different sources of power. And again, many political questions come down to who are you going to help make money? And who are you going to give offices to? And who are you going to reward? And who are you going to punish, even financially? Many political questions come down to that. And factions will develop around that. So this question is driving at, and I was doing this in this course as well. If you look at like the Protestant elites, and Samuel Huntington admits this in his book, right? Also that in the 40s and 50s, the Protestant elites, they all recognized we got to let Catholics and Jews into the elites. So beginning in the 50s, you start to see this dynamic of various Catholic and Jewish and Protestant factions and how they basically are warring against each other. Now, one of our colleagues in Denver, who comes to the equivalent of this seminar in Denver, he produced some graphs for me, which are very interesting. He scraped a lot of data to basically show that, kind of interesting. If you just take the categories Protestant, Catholic, Jew, the percentage of the elite population of Jewish and Catholic has remained kind of constant from the 50s to the present. The percentage of Jewish participation in the elites. Now, the elites could be the elites in culture, the elites in politics, in finance, business, the military, entertainment, right? So the elites are going to be in all of these areas of life, not just Congress, though Congress is one of them. But so he actually is interesting because he showed just sociologically that the Jewish people, are, they're 1 or 2% of the population, but they occupy at least a third of the elite. They're a faction of at least of the third in many of these areas, right? Television, film, media, porn, organized sports, the owning of teams, banking, the financial system, etc. Also academia, especially the elite academic institutions, the Ivy League. When I was at Harvard, for example, 40% of the faculty were Jewish, just as like 20 to 25% of the student population was Jewish. So it's like they're definitely outrepresented based on their percentage of the population. So part of when I was teaching this course, part of what we want to understand is, what are the cultural, for each group, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, what are the cultural dispositions that they bring, right? What are the values that they bring? And are those values, like we say, Judeo-Christian values, right? The values that the elites bring to the conversation among the elites, are they really the same? Or are there different values that they bring to the elite conversation? So this was not part of the course that I taught, but for example, we all remember Obamacare, and we all remember how the Catholic hospitals and religious orders were trying to get exemptions from Obamacare. Well, of the 36, for example, right, of the 36 Jewish organizations in D.C., in Washington, D.C., 34 of them made specific petitions. 34, these are the Jewish organizations in D.C. 34 of them made specific petitions to Congress to not exempt any Catholic institutions from the birth control and abortion requirements in Obamacare. So in other words, we don't share the same values, right? That's a graphic example, right? So there is this fellow in Denver, what he pointed out was that, yes, there is overrepresentation and way beyond their numbers. Right? And usually in an oligarchic system, wealth brings you representation. That's all I have to say about this question, but there is a couple.
I like the propaganda part because it's related to the conspiracy theories that are all out there on things, and just distinguishing, it's a topic that the truth from non-truth. How do you distinguish that and pick out propaganda?
I think part of it is there's an art. I mean, there are whole courses, and part of it is reading. Like you read Jacques Ellul's Propaganda, and you start to see ways in which it makes it more clear how propaganda is used, right? And then you start to, once you see it all over the place. Before you see it, you might not notice it. So, for example, I had the benefit when I was in college of taking a course. I took a series of courses from a professor who was, before he was a professor, he worked for the State Department. And one of his roles in the State Department was manipulating headlines. It was propaganda, basically. Manipulating headlines to prepare people for this or that or the other thing, to hide something, right, that you don't want to be known. And so by him giving us many, many different examples Well, that kind of got my antenna up for whenever. Like I remember one example he gave us was it was before the first Iraq War, and he said I think there's going to be an Iraq War, and just you wait and see. They're going to bring out the yellow ribbons, right? And that for me that struck a chord because when I was growing up in my home, one of the records that we had this song on it, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. And he explained to us how that was a propaganda song for the Vietnam War, right? To try to get people more pro Vietnam War, more kind of sentimentally attached to elements of the Vietnam War. And so he said, you'll see whenever, he said at the time, the world has changed, but he was telling us at that time, he said, look, you're going to see whenever throughout your life, whenever they're trying to propagandize for something, they'll use ribbons and flags and colors. Right. So that when one of the times I first noticed this on my own, because by this point my professor had disappeared. He was dead but I remember as a professor in 2005 when I saw the Orange Revolution taking place in Ukraine. And then the CIA now is just a standard thing they do with these when they're encouraging a revolution somewhere. They get a flag and a color, and they'll even call it the Orange Revolution, the Green Revolution, the Purple Revolution, this revolution. That's always a marker of a. And I had the good benefit after the Ukraine thing happened in 2004 2005. A few years later, I happened to be at a conference of the French agent who was in the Ukraine. And he was able to confirm with me both that, yes, there was a moment the CIA operatives all entered, and there was a moment they all packed up and went home. And so I would say in our own time, I mentioned this book by Jacques Ellul. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but there was a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston who wrote a manual. He wrote a manual. It's like a 56-step manual for how to enter into a country and to use propaganda to cultivate a revolution. And he did it because he was a democratic activist. He thought, well, this is going to be the way that you can get people together and use signs and symbols and propaganda for the good, right? To really promote democracy. And I'm blanking on this guy's name, but it would be easy to find it. So what happened is that the CIA he did such a good job that the CIA took his book and they incorporated it into their training manuals for how to use propaganda, both in foreign countries and also within the United States. And so like reviewing a book like that manual would be one way of starting to identify. Another simple way that some other ways that propaganda works. Well, my professor explained the manipulation of headlines. We're gonna give you the government. We prepare the memo, and we give you the memo, the press release, and we can shade the press release over time to influence how we want the population to think. So again, one way is just looking at headlines. I would imagine these days, well, I know these days still a primary mechanism of propaganda is what's left of the traditional CNN, Fox News, ABC, CBS, NBC, right? Most of the government will also send operatives into these agencies to act as journalists, right? Again, as a way of trying to condition. I mean, corporations will do it too. They'll get journalists they'll get their people in different areas as journalists because they want to shape how public opinion is being made with respect to whatever products these corporations produce. So corporations and governments, they do the same thing there. So I mean, yeah, I guess I'm just a long-winded answer, but there's several. I think Jacques Ellul's book is a key book. This book that came out of University of Massachusetts in Boston is a key book. I would also say there's a professor of propaganda, a guy named Mark Crispin Miller, and he has a Substack called Notes from the Underground, and he likes to when he taught, he's retired from teaching, but when he taught, he liked to always like shows. He would teach classes how they were being subject to propaganda during that semester that the class was going on, different events in life. So he does this from time to time also on his Substack. In a given moment, he'll point towards all the different mechanisms of propaganda that we're being subject to even now on his Substack.
Is it Randall Marlin? He's the professor from Boston.
I don't remember the name at all. But that sounds right. He's dead now, but he's whoever he is.
The
He's
book was 2002.
yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. What's the name again?
Randall Marlin.
Randall Marland. Right. So those books are very useful. Well, even Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, it's very useful. It's very the mechanisms of propaganda that he describes in the book. Again, they're very primitive, but he was bragging in the book like, we succeeded in doing this. This is what we did. Wasn't it great? Right. So those are different books where you can see the mechanisms at work.
Still difficult.
Pardon?
Still difficult.
Well, you got to study.
COVID and all that other stuff was like that was really.
That was also a lot of propaganda. Yeah.
That was really
Yeah. Well, but again, I think that's what.
obvious, but it was-
But I would just say that hopefully in the different courses, in the different subjects we cover this summer, I'll be able to give specific instances of it happening. Yeah. Oh, no, you're the moderator.
Kevin has. Oh, sorry, your name.
Yeah.
Kevin, go ahead.
So COVID woke up a lot of people.
I think so. Yeah.
You know, propaganda, conspiracy. I've seen a lot of people in my life and, you know, that I know that have gotten, you know, into a place of distrust where now it's like conspiracies around every corner.
Yeah.
Everything's a conspiracy. So
Good.
kind of so you say good.
But yeah, I know.
I mean, how can you know, because some things it's difficult because it's not always the conspiracy, right?
Right.
And so how do you work against that? And then the other part of my question, I had heard once, and I just kind of want to get your thoughts on this. I had heard once a benefit of AI is that maybe with AI now coming out and getting better and better replicating images and videos, and if it's utilized to trick people, that the common person is going to start waking up and say, no, we need to question everything we see and hear now.
Yeah.
Because we just can't rely on our eyes, our ears,
Right.
and what we
Right.
see visually. So, thoughts on that?
Yeah. I have lots of thoughts. I think one thing is.
Probably, can you repeat the question too? Just
Repeat the question. So I think one question is actually it was also part of the previous question.
Yeah.
This word conspiracy theory, right? And a lot of people during COVID, they seem to really wake up to how they were being subject to propaganda. One of the things that leads to is the person becoming very skeptical of everything, because all he sees out there is conspiracy theories, right? And then this could be further compounded by AI, which could produce images, evidence, schemes, whatever that are once people become aware of that, well, they can just become really skeptical of everything. This problem goes back to Plato's Republic. In part of Plato's Republic, he specifically speaks about the danger. Once you're aware that the sophists, who don't think that there's a truth, all that they're trying to do is manipulate perceptions. There's a danger that you just become skeptical of everything, right? You just become a skeptic. And so that's the danger, you might say, of the conspiratorial mind. right? The person that becomes skeptical of everything. Here, I think it's helpful to first of all, to understand like this problem is an old problem. It has a modern, again, as we've been saying all along, there's a modern iteration of it because of technology that makes the old problem appear in a different set of circumstances. So even the word conspiracy theory, how did conspiracy theory enter the language in a significant way? It's, well, the Warren Commission. It put out its false explanation of the Kennedy assassination. We know now, well, what happened. And this, I think, is essential. It's essential for this. This was taught to me by someone I respected. I think it's like essential science. How do you verify? Right? There is such a thing as verification. How do you verify what is being said? Yes, maybe you can't accept. Maybe there's some things you can't accept on face value. Or maybe there's some things you do trust because you trust that source. Right? So you trust that what they say is true. You still need to verify. If you want to say I'm more than like I'm certain about this. I'm more than just hypothetically accepting it. Right? So this is essential. Is this an area where I'm going to verify? Right? And so precisely the term conspiracy theory was brought up because a lot of people began asking questions and about the Warren Commission. And essentially their questions was the essence of their questions were, how do you verify this? Based on the evidence that you've given us, I don't see how you can verify this. That was and enough people began asking those questions. It was getting out of control. So the CIA had a meeting and they said, well, what do we do? How do we answer these objections? Because they're getting to be too numerous. And so the idea became, well, let's just accuse them of being conspiracy theorists, of propagating conspiracy theory. We have enough friends in the media. We'll be able to influence them to use this term. So we don't have to answer the objections. We don't have to verify. Instead, we'll just say these are conspiracy theorists. And that's when, if you can do studies now. When does conspiracy theory really enter into the discourse? It's at that moment. It's right after the memo. We have the memo now. This is all. You can verify all of this, right? But no, this is I think an essential point, and I think this is how you can help people not to become skeptics. They may understand. There's a huge. Plato understood this. It's in the Republic, right? It's a huge effort. In books 7 and 8 of the Republic, he goes through all the different ways in which someone can get derailed from the pursuit of the truth. I think one time I gave a lecture on it. The 24 ways you can get derailed from pursuing the truth. Why? Because it's not easy to remain committed to verifying something. So, but I think also, when you study these things, you also realize the CIA, corporation does this. The British government does this, right? They'll introduce false narratives to make it seem like anybody that's questioning their narrative is a crazy guy, right? So that's also, you got to be aware. In other words, you got to be aware of the fact that, I know this from the study of Jimmy Hoffa's murder. Who murdered Hoffa? Some of the things I've looked into in my own life, that they will, but corporations do this in areas of food and health and whatnot, right? They'll introduce false studies, and then they'll attack the false studies because they'll basically say, oh, anybody that questions what we're proposing is clearly like one of these crazy people that produce these false studies. So in a way, yes, it is there's all these landmines out there. There's all these intellectual landmines out there. And on the one hand, you don't want to deny the dangers. On the other hand, you also want to say, well, okay, this theory that's there, how can even if it's challenging the Warren Commission, what's the verification, right? How can we verify? And of course, logic is one way to verify. If people are producing logical fallacies, well, to identify the fallacy so that you see how they're misleading, right? This is where logic is a great tool, especially knowing the fallacies can be a great tool for understanding how I could be being led astray. So again, I would just say that, yes, I know people can just get caught up with conspiracies, but the way I think you resist that is by, how can I verify? How can I verify?
Actually, could have started back at the time of Christ because they saw the miracles.
And they denied.
They saw him. They saw Lazarus raised from the dead.
Yeah,
And it's the same application, but this is much cheaper because it's
Right.
God.
right.
And so I become a nation from that. It's stemming from the denial of Christ.
Well, yeah,
Or truth.
yeah, that's right. No, I mean, they paid the guards. You saw him after he rose from the dead. Like, create the story that the disciples came and took him away,
Yeah.
and that's believed to this day, right? They're already in the Gospels. They can say that.
People also don't care.
Well,
Like with the COVID thing.
there are some people who,
It's like,
yeah,
just
but
go along with the
well, that's
whole-
a different problem, right? That's not the problem of the conspiracy. So the question here is, well, there are a lot of people just don't care, and that's another pedagogical challenge, right? So one pedagogical challenge is the person that, okay, yeah, I realize there's we've been duped, and I'm willing now to start to investigate, and I could get caught up in a kind of I could get caught up in the explanations to such a degree that I don't think there's any truth, and then that could just take us in all sorts of crazy directions. But then the other kind of danger, yeah, is the person that you say is like a normie, or a person that, there's all sorts of different ways of characterizing it. The person just doesn't want to learn. The person that basically says, I'm satisfied with my authorities. I trust them. And if you're not, I so trust my authorities that if you're not one of them, then I'm just not going to listen to you. And that kind of person is a little bit, it's a tougher nut to crack. A lot of times that person has to suffer something in a serious way, right? As Benjamin Franklin said, that right, experience keeps an expensive school, and there are few who learn from it. So there is this, there are people. Again, this is what Jacques Ellul was saying, that the class of people that are the most subject to propaganda are the intellectual classes. Because why? They ironically, they have their authorities they trust, and they don't ask a lot of questions. They don't really have to verify their authorities. And they can use their intellectual skills to be skeptical towards anyone that's trying to challenge them. And that's why they're, in some sense, the biggest victims of propaganda. So, for example, when I was in Harvard a couple weeks ago, and I was invited, I was just there for a workshop, and since I had been there, someone invited me to come and do a lunch with some students. And we talked about a lot of these same issues with respect to the Iran war. And of course, the guy that invited me, I was telling him about our little group here, a little group we have in Denver. And he said, he kind of just blurted out, he said, well, yeah, probably all the guys you're dealing with there, they're not the real objects of propaganda the way these Harvard students are, right? When it comes to, why? Because the Harvard students are being conditioned to enter into the elites. Right? One student that I had at Harvard started up a company for giving advice to elections, right? And that's an elite thing, an elite profession. So the Harvard students are going to be much more subject to kind of propaganda than from 2023 to the present. there's been this intra-Jewish fight at Harvard, right? And so it's very interesting as a Catholic seeing the two factions within Judaism fighting with each other, trying to propagandize the students. It's very interesting because that's an example where you see it happening.
What are the two groups?
Basically, progressive Jews and neoconservative Jews, right? So the progressive Jews would be the Jews that align themselves with the Pritzker family, and the neoconservative Jews would be the ones that align themselves a little bit more with Paul Singer, Miriam Adelson, the ones that have given money to the Trump administration, right?
They both Israel first.
They're both, yeah, and but with different shades, little bit different shades. Yeah, yes, but in different ways. So one is just more like the Miriam Adelson, Paul Singer. They're just much more. Our guy is Netanyahu, right? That's our guy.
2 weeks away from the bomb.
Right. Since they found it on Sumerian tablets.
It was, I know.
Yes. Speaking of old propaganda.
I heard him say that in 1992.
Yeah, I did a whole chapter on this in my dissertation, so I could go in depth about it if you wanted me to. But I think the other faction is they're still pro-Israel, but they want to be more pro-Israel, advancing.
Culture.
Kind of advancing. They want rainbows on their bombs. They want to paint rainbows on their bombs.
Gay rainbows.
Yeah. Right. So it's more cultural at the same time, and so basically more sophisticated in a way over time,
Interesting.
but the same goal.
Any additional questions?
I had a question.
Yeah.
Would you be able to just briefly, or not really a question, but just a request, could you frame out the courses that you laid out for this? Because it seems like there's little mini epics epochs that
So my thought was,
yeah, and just in the context of what you presented, could you kind of give that an overview? I have it here if you want to see it.
yeah. So my thought was, okay, who's Walt Kowalski? He's a Polish Catholic ethnic living in a neighborhood, Poletown in Detroit, that's now undergoing the still called threat from the Hmong, the blacks, and the Hispanics. The Hmong but Walt is a guy who stayed in his neighborhood when his children and grandchildren all moved to the suburbs, and his neighbors all moved to the suburbs. So what I was thinking is, there's some themes that are worth covering, and you could almost go in 25-year increments dealing with those themes. So you go all the way back to World War I. World War I would be Americanism, the First World War, the birth of propaganda against Catholics. World War I is, right, the Poles came to just as one group among the Irish, the Poles, the Germans, the Italians, right? The Poles are coming to the United States, the 1880s, 1890s, early 2000s. I think it's in the 1880s and 1890s when this parish became a Polish parish. It was originally an Irish parish. So I thought the first 25 years could just be the beginning, the Polish people as the Catholic ethnics who are here, and also then the First World War, which is the first time that propaganda is going to be directed against them. And also the Catholic bishops at that time they have a very peculiar stance that they take towards Rome, because they're trying to get their foot in the door with American elites. They don't want to be left out. And that creates another interesting dynamic.
Is that called Americanism?
Yeah. But also, I wrote an article on the Pope's diplomacy during the First World War and how the bishops collaborated or not with the Pope in his diplomatic efforts. So then the next course would on this. So that's the 27th of June, and then the 17th of July would be I'm thinking 1925 to 1950. So that's the birth of the suburbs. And there I did research at one point. I gestured towards it earlier this evening, where this professor at the University of Chicago was instrumental in coming up with the plan to move the Catholics to the suburbs, to make them more susceptible to state propaganda. So there's all sorts of little interesting strands there. Then the next that's the July 17th. July 31st, John Courtney Murray, Doctrinal Warfare, Vatican II. Now we're after the Second World War. We're going from, let's say, 1950 to 1975. That's the time of the sexual revolution. That's the time of the Vatican Council. That's the time where Catholics start to listen more to Time magazine than what's in their church bulletins. And then the Second Vatican, John Courtney Murray is an instrumental figure for both what happened to Catholics leading up to the council, during and after the council. He's a central figure. So if you can understand him, you can understand that time period. And then it's a little bit of piggybacking onto that. The next one, sexual liberation and social control. You got to kind of deal with the 60s and the 70s and all the changes that took place in Catholic families with respect to birth control and abortion, the leadership of the church dissenting from Humanae Vitae in this country, right? The disaster that caused. When I used to lecture on this, I got brought in front of several deans for this statement when I used to lecture on this. But basically, I said you have to think of that time period, especially for the Catholics in America, as a moral nuclear weapon, just exploding. And it was so rapid, so quick. But the groundwork had been laid in the 1950s. And I think St. Josemaria understood that, actually. I have some anecdotes along those lines. Then, now we're going 75 to 2000, 2008. I think the fundamental changes that took place beginning in 1974. One of the great things that happened in the United States, I think because of Quadragesimo Anno, because of Catholic social teaching, is that the United States began to give great value to the building up a middle class. And we gave great value to regulations that enabled the growth of the middle class. That's the American dream. And I think that there were conversions in the 1930s because of Quadragesimo Anno, and that it's a papal encyclical that got translated into policies that facilitated the growth of the middle class. And you see, beginning in the 1970s, a change in the economic system that basically guts the middle class, leading to today, where you have, and it's been accelerated, especially since COVID, the flow of money from the middle class to the top 10%, basically using financial regulations in the favor of the top 10%. And it was just announced this past week, Larry Fink, I think his name is Larry Fink, announcing that we're going to use pensions, right? One of the things they use to gut the middle class is they take their pensions and I think they use fraudulent mechanisms to gut them, to transfer that wealth to the 10%. And Larry Fink was saying we're going to use pensions to finance data centers, right? Which means, I know this. I have a little picture into this because I know my dad saw this happening in Detroit. He saw the pensions being used, how they were being fleeced in order to create false construction projects that then the people who were using the pensions just ran away with the dough, all legally. And the construction projects were never completed because they crashed the economy right at the moment to not have to fulfill the construction contracts. But they got all the money from the pensions. So I think I think the economic thing needs to be dealt with. That's the article that Dr. Jones sent around. There's other ways we could deal with it, but one way would be this article that Seamus sent around in the email, his review of a book by this lady Hirschfield. I happened to meet her when I was at Harvard, so I have some experience with her also. And then I think after 1990 to the present, we got to deal with foreign policy because of the post World War II American empire. And the one group that drives the most American foreign policy from 1990 to the present are the neoconservatives. So that's where I thought it's worth having a whole session on them. And then, as always, I think always it's always great having, at least when I was a teacher, it was always great having sessions of let's just talk about whatever. It's a medieval custom was at least 2 or 3 times a semester, there would be the quodlibetal questions, right? Quodlibetal means whatever. Like, let's have a day of questions about whatever, because that's just, it's one of the best ways we learn, I think. So that'd be the idea of the one in September. And then in September, I'll know more my schedule for the year and what's possible.
I have a question.
Good.
Relating to what's possible. This is a question that came from a friend from Denver, Father. And so, how should Catholics be more aware of these agendas, and what should they do to counteract them in a concrete manner?
Yeah, that's why we're doing this seminar, right? And so, because the idea is, there's, I think part of what I'd like to do is, I think when you study these things historically, one of the things we'll realize that there were deficiencies at the time. There were both human deficiencies and there were theological or supernatural deficiencies, right? And so one thing you do is you start to acquire the skills that you need. Also, so that's one thing. Another thing is, yes, so I think in studying things historically, you start to see, well, what are the skills I could acquire? If I were in that moment, what are the skills I would have used in order to not have things end up in, let's say, such a disastrous way, right? So that's always a question we can ask. I think also, just in the course of my studies and seeing things over the years, part of what we want to do is we want to understand our times. So we're studying these things historically because there's an effect now in our times. But also, once if we can understand better the times that we're in, then we can also understand, well, given my circumstances, what can I do? Maybe I'm the father of a family, and all I can do is I gotta educate my children well. Maybe that's all I can do. That St. Josemaria would say that's fine. But there's also a question of, like during COVID, there was a lady that was coming to me, and she was saying, all this stuff is happening, this and that, and the churches are being shut down, and I want to go to Mass. And I kind of said to her, I said, look, get on the Board of Health of your township. And here in, there's all these little hamlets in Boston, around Boston. Get on the Board of Health in your little hamlet, and you can help the churches open. And she did it. And she helped the churches open, right? Because nobody else wanted to get on the board or whatever, right? And then other people, so in other words, part of it too, like this this guy at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, I actually think his 56 point document for how to exercise democracy, there's a lot of good practical advice there, where if you wanted to get involved in politics, a lot of what this guy says, it's good practical advice of what to do, right? And a lot of times, I don't know why fully, but also I have a friend who's starting an institute because he understands we're entering chaotic times. Like, for example, I think he's convinced, and I think he's right, these next 2 election cycles are going to be really bizarre. But what that means is you got to use different techniques. If you're going to run for office, because they're going to be bizarre, there could be lots of opportunities to enter in. Just as thinking of politics, right? There could be opportunities to get lower level positions, but then you got to know how to do it, right? So my friend's starting an institute. What are the techniques you would use in a chaotic time for getting into some of these positions? and because they're not going to be the standard techniques. Right. So part of what I also hope to do is just make you aware of some of the things that I'm aware of out there that that could be used for like concrete using our intelligence creatively. What could we do if St. Josemaria would say everybody can live their faith. Everybody can, in his profession, try to sanctify his profession, do it well, be competent, do it for the sake of service of his family and society, right? And then there are others, because of time, because of circumstances, because of their position in life, they can do more in culture, in politics, in society, right? When I was in Rome, there was a Polish couple. They started a website called Poles in Defense of Children and Marriage, something like Poles in Defense of Children and Marriage, because there was no institute like that in Poland. Within 5 years, they were in front of the Polish legislature writing legislation basically to protect children from online pornography, right? So again, sometimes there's very simple, and again, it's just this was just a couple, their kids were a little bit older, they had the time to do it, they started this website, and bam, it happened. So there are things, again, part of it too is like, what does your creativity suggest to you? So I think we can point to examples, but then we have to, so St. Josemaria would say, yes, there's going to be some of us, given our circumstances, there could be things we could do. He says this third area, not everybody can do it because of, even Plato says this in the Republic, right? Plato says, or in the Laws, sorry. He says, so many people just having a wife and children, that occupies all of your energy. He says, not everybody can do the third part of writing the laws or becoming a playwright or, influencing this thing, but there are some who can. So if they can, I want to prepare you for that.
Could you try again?
Oh, now it's transcribing everything I'm saying.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Peter Thiel.
Peter Thiel down in Argentina is keeping track. I did have 2 seminars with him when I was at Harvard, by the way.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, 2 days, 2 different days.
So what do we tell people about this class? Invite them like a one-liner or something?
I would just say Father Jeff was a professor. He taught a course called The American Experience at the university, and he's going to give a kind of summary. He's going to give an abridged version of that course.
This is what to say to invite people
in over the next 3 months, two times a month, and that course had to deal with the relationship between Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish elites in the 20th century in the United States. I mean, I guess there could be, but so the American experience.
One more question here.
So, to your point about weird cycles, right? I think we see a little bit of that with Spencer Pratt and the kind of campaign he's been running for mayor's race.
So he's not going to. I don't think he's going to get in the top 2.
But it's been definitely out of the norm, right?
No, that's what that. Yeah.
So what do you think is happening right now in the American political system? Is it a realignment? Is it just a pendulum swing? I know it's hard to encapsulate it, but how would you characterize?
Yeah, in the 90s, when I was in graduate school, we were talking about, there was always this thing of, we should be headed towards, there should be a time in which there's a realignment, a transformation of the parties. And I think we are in a time of general, I think one of the reasons we're in a time of general chaos is we are in a time when the ideas that shaped the political and legal relationships of the past 80 years, they're coming undone, right? And so when it's coming undone, that's an opportunity, but it also it's an opportunity basically. I personally believe that the election of 2024 was pointing towards what could have been a realignment, bringing together the old working class Catholics who are now essentially conservatives with the old pre-1950 Republican Party, which was America First. And they were bringing that together with the Maha movement, Robert Kennedy's people, which represented kind of medical freedom, food freedom, also with Tulsi Gabbard's faction, which was kind of a little bit of a left center, but America First mentality, right? We should only fight wars that are serious wars, right? But other than that, and also Tulsi Gabbard represented, both from the left and the right, a group of people that were saying we need to reevaluate our entire deep state structures that are based on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. They didn't want to be assessed and maybe changed by the president. And so the deep state structures have taken control of both our domestic and foreign life. And Tulsi Gabbard represented an important faction that could have coalesced, and that did coalesce in 2024. And you saw in 2024, this faction was an electorally possible faction, group of interests, right? That's all. I think they've snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in the last 9 months. And so now the question is, have they so destroyed that possibility between the old ethnic Catholics and these other groups? Has that been so destroyed that there's going to be some other transformation, some other reconfiguration in the next 4 to 10 years, or what, And so that's where I think we stand right now. That a realignment almost happened. The elements of it were all there, but they so mismanaged from April to the present that they've destroyed it. So now we're in another moment where maybe, it's interesting. My understanding, what I think I'm seeing among some of the leaders in the Democratic faction is a pulling back on the rainbow stuff, right? Because I think they see that you can't unite a national coalition with that strong, with basically the Pritzker rainbows, that being part of it. So we'll see. I think we'll see. I think most likely the next national election for president, we don't know yet who that's going to be as far as on the Democratic side. It's going to be someone that'll probably come out of the woodwork, who could potentially represent a different sewing together of groups in a national election. Unlike most public figures that we're aware of right now.
And is it as simple as they just, well, you said April, right? Is it as simple as they just went with the Jewish influence or whatever you want?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what happened in April. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's because the president has dementia. I think there's a strong argument that he has dementia, and more he's acting like a 2-year-old with early onset dementia. I don't know if he's been blackmailed in some way because of the Epstein files. I don't know if he was. I don't think it's the case that the whole time. Some people say the whole time he was really one of them, right? And he just I don't think that's I think that's too tendentious. But I think something happened in April. But what exactly happened? I don't know. I think that the first two things I mentioned are the most likely. But that's one of these things where I don't know. It's hard to know. Probably only with time will we know more. But clearly it's a betrayal of. In fact, one of the interesting things about this coming fall, those who have studied elections. So my first PhD was in politics. So that's why I'm saying some of these things. Also, This is why a little bit like some of the things we're going to do, like there's a link tonight, but it's a closed link because it says a priest. Some people might misunderstand what I'm saying, and that's why it's like things from when I was teaching as a professor, but it's a little bit of a closed group. So it's me and my friends is kind of the idea. So it's not an activity of Opus Dei, just to make that clear. But I know from the study of elections, there's this whole thing of when there's a party like who controls the presidency, and then there's a midterm election. When does the swing? It doesn't always go this way. But when does it really go this way, in kind of a bigger way? So if you look at all the elections going back to the First World War, even there's only been 3. So you look at what are the factors that cause bigger swings. The factors that cause bigger swings in the opposite direction is a war. It could be almost any war, because war over time is unpopular. Economy going sour, and economy going sour is not the stock market. Economy going sour is consumer confidence. Michigan, the University of Michigan has a great consumer confidence study, which is more interesting to look at for the economy than the stock market. Like that's all a sign of propaganda, right? Especially on Fox News and CNN. They'll say, oh, the stock market's up, the economy's going great, right? That's absolute economic propaganda in my book. The third thing is there's some sort of scandal that's like an impending or a potential serious scandal that's overshadowing the president. The fourth thing is a sense of betrayal by the loyal supporters of the president's team. There's never been a midterm election where all 4 of those factors have been present. Whenever 2 of them have been present, there's been a wild swing in the other direction. So get ready. Right? No, but there's never been a midterm election where there's been some where 2 of those have been present. War like the Vietnam War with Nixon, right? Or the Korean War with Eisenhower would be two examples of a war being present. And also, both with Nixon and Eisenhower, there was a little economic dip during those times. But there's never been all 4 of those factors present in the same midterm election. And you're going to have that this fall. Right? That's the time we're in from a political standpoint. But also you're already seeing also in like just in Iowa the other day, the guy ran as a Robert Kennedy Republican, the guy who won the primary on Tuesday, was Tuesday or Wednesday this week. So he figured it out. This guy up in Maine, who's probably going to get the Democratic nominee, he's running on kind of a Democratic, Robert Kennedy, Trump America First platform as a Democrat. There's a lot of people in Maine that have Trump signs and then this Democrat guy signs in their front yards. So you're going to see clever politicians are going to market themselves because they realize there's a vacuum here that can be met.
Any additional questions? Anybody else?
And so what I'll do is I'll have Seamus we'll send around a syllabus, maybe a little bit more than what I sent around already, just kind of laying out what we're going to do. And then I just thought, if there's anything to read, I guess the final point would just be, where'd I put it? Oh yeah, I just thought the third part of this book, the Dr. Jones's book, Walking with a Bible and a Gun. I just thought that this book, the third part of it, deals with the 20th century. So just to have, if there is something common that we could all read, and it's a book, it's in a way it's a response to Samuel Huntington's book, Who Are We? It's a book about American identity, in this case in the 20th century. So much of the discussion in this book will also mirror many of these topics that I'd like to speak about in this course.
One random question. What do you think about polls?
I would say most polls are the same thing as conspiracy theory. No, just in the sense of, I think most polls that are put out there are propaganda. So right now, what's happening? Right now, what's happening is that the Republican National Committee has paid every major pollster. If you want to get business in the fall, I want you to produce phony numbers to make it appear like Republicans are more popular than they really are. And there's only one guy I know that didn't take the money. Well, there's two guys I know that didn't take the money. One guy didn't take the money, but he hasn't really said much since January, since this offer was made. The other guy, he's always kind of independently financed. He gets basically small donations from people. So he just told him, you can do whatever you want. I'm going to do what I want to do. But so a lot of the polling that you see, it's very ideologically motivated, and and because what they're trying to do with the Republican polling, they're trying to create a scenario to get the outcome they want to get. But it's hard to see how that's going to work. So most polling that you see, it's very ideologically motivated, and it's in the public realm for propaganda purposes. But serious the campaigns themselves, every campaign has serious pollsters that do serious polling, and they get very close to the truth. And you can do a pretty good job of getting a sense of what people are thinking. Now, again, it's both an art and a science how you go about it. So I think a pollster who's very honest and accurate, and he might make mistakes, but he'll admit his mistakes, is Richard Barris. And he does a weekly show. And his polling is pretty good. And he bases his polling based on a book that was written in the 1960s by Kevin Phillips called The Emerging Republican Majority. It's a breakdown of the United States almost by county. Basically saying if you really want to poll well in a national election, you got to understand the ethnic identity of who settled that county. And but you got to get that specific. And I can think this guy, Richard Barris, he's modeled his whole career on updating that Kevin Phillips book. So I would say he's a trustworthy pollster. And he will also explain to you when there's polls out there that are false or erroneous, why they are erroneous.
What was his last name? Richard
Barris, Baris. He has a YouTube channel, Locals channel, and I forget the exact name of it though. Something for the people. I think we should go.
Well, take a break.
Yeah, go outside,
Yeah, okay.
enjoy.
Take a break.
All right,
you very
we'll
much.
meet on our next meeting is June 27th. Saturday, June 27th.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was
You're
very
welcome.
nice.
It's a pleasure.